Forget everything you think you know about what just happened on the United States-Mexico border. What is being sold to you as a diplomatic breakthrough, as a moment of cooperation and shared resolve between Washington and Mexico City, is not what it appears to be. Not even close. Let me be clear about something that both the Biden administration's remaining loyalists and the Trump political machine are desperately hoping you will not understand. Within hours, and I mean hours, of the ink drying on that border security agreement, the Sinaloa cartel executed a coordinated assault on 3 simultaneous fronts across Sonora State involving armored vehicle convoys, military-grade communications jamming, and a level of tactical precision that no street gang, no narco-militia, produces without state-level training. That happened. It was deliberate, and it was a message. Having spent decades in military intelligence, having sat in rooms where assessments of non-state armed actors were translated into policy, I can tell you with complete certainty that what you witnessed in those first 18 hours after that agreement was signed was not chaos. It was calculation. Let me walk you through exactly why this matters. Because the surface-level reporting you are getting from every major outlet is missing the operational architecture beneath what just occurred. The agreement itself, signed with considerable fanfare and the kind of bilateral imagery that governments deploy when they want optics more than outcomes, committed Mexico to enhance border enforcement cooperation, expanded joint intelligence sharing on cartel logistics networks, and accelerated extradition timelines for designated cartel leadership figures. On paper, it reads like progress. In practice, anyone who has actually analyzed cartel command structures and their penetration of Mexican federal and state institutions understands that this agreement carried an immediate threat signal to specific criminal organizations whose operational survival depends on the precise cooperation mechanisms that document propose to dismantle. The Sinaloa cartel is not a criminal enterprise in the traditional sense that American policymakers and media commentators apply that framework. It is a parallel state. It controls territory across 11 Mexican states with a degree of administrative coherence that rivals, and in certain functional dimensions exceeds, the Mexican federal government's actual reach. It fields an armed wing estimated between 45,000 and 60,000 fighters, equipped with material that has included armored vehicles, crew-served weapons, drone modification programs, and encrypted communications infrastructure. The logistics network sustaining those forces operates with supply chain discipline that American military planners would recognize as genuinely professional. This is not hyperbole. This is the operational reality that intelligence assessments have documented for a decade, while official briefings sanitize the picture for political consumption. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is the part that no official press conference will address. When the Sinaloa faction, loyal to the Los Chapitos leadership structure, the sons of Joaquin Guzman, received the text of that border agreement through their intelligence penetration of Mexican federal communications, the response was not panic. It was a military planning sequence. Within 6 hours of the signing ceremony in Mexico City, convoy movements were observed by satellite imagery out of 3 staging areas in Sonora State, specifically in the corridor running between Caborca and Altar, a geographic choke point that controls overland trafficking routes into Arizona's Lukeville and Sasabe entry corridors. Those convoys were not resupply movements, they were force projection. 15 vehicles, a mix of armored pickup trucks with improvised steel plating, and at least 2 vehicles identified as carrying crew-served weapons in covered bed configurations, moved in tactical spacing consistent with trained convoy doctrine rather than the bunched, undisciplined movement patterns that characterize militias operating without professional instruction. The simultaneous communications jamming that law enforcement in 3 municipalities reported that same evening, disrupting frequencies used by Sonora State Police and federal investigative units, required equipment that costs between $80,000 and $150,000 per unit at military specification grade. Civilian-grade jammers do not produce the broadband suppression that was documented. What you had was coordinated electronic warfare combined with ground force movement. That is a military operation. Call it what it is. Before we go any further, I need you to understand the geographic dimension of what this means strategically. The Sonora Corridor is not simply one trafficking route among many. It is the primary overland channel for fentanyl precursor movement from Pacific port entry points, specifically Manzanillo and Cerro Cardenas, northward toward the Arizona border. The Drug Enforcement Administration's own flow analysis, portions of which have been made available through congressional testimony, estimates that between 60 and 70% of fentanyl entering the United States through overland routes transits this corridor or its immediate network tributaries. When the Sinaloa organization moved forces into that corridor, within hours of an agreement targeting cartel logistics, they were not reacting emotionally. They were securing their most critical economic infrastructure against the possibility that Mexican federal forces, newly emboldened by bilateral agreement and the implicit American pressure that accompanies it, might attempt interdiction operations in territory the cartel has effectively controlled since 2019. The tactical decision to conduct the operation in those first 18 hours was itself the message. It demonstrated three things simultaneously. First, that the cartel had advance intelligence on the agreement's terms before or immediately upon signing, indicating penetration of the negotiating process itself. Second, that pre-positioned forces existed in sufficient readiness to execute coordinated multi-location operations without additional preparation time, meaning this contingency had been planned in advance. Third, that Mexican federal authorities either could not or would not respond with sufficient force to contest the cartel's movement, which is the most damning indicator of all. Keep watching, because the next part is where everything starts to unravel. The Mexican government's response to those 18 hours of cartel activity was a press release. A press release announcing that security forces were monitoring the situation and that the integrity of the border agreement remained the administration's firm commitment. In Culiacan, the Sinaloa state capital, 3 municipal police officers who had been identified in cartel intelligence as cooperating with federal investigators were executed within 24 hours of the convoy movements in Sonora. Precise targeting, no collateral, professional termination of identified threats. The cartel was not only demonstrating military capability in Sonora, it was demonstrating intelligence capability and enforcement reach in its home state simultaneously. These are not coincidences operating on the same timeline. This is a coordinated strategic communication directed at every Mexican official and security officer who might be weighing their personal risk calculation as they consider whether to actually implement the cooperation mechanisms in that border agreement. I have been in enough environments where coercion operates as a governing mechanism to recognize what this looks like. What Mexico is experiencing right now is not a crime wave. It is a demonstration of sovereign challenge. The cartel is communicating, with lethal precision, that agreements signed in Mexico City do not change the operational reality on the ground in the territories they control. And the tragic, uncomfortable truth that I take no pleasure in stating is that at this moment, they are correct. What I have not yet explained is the American dimension of this failure, and it is substantial. The border agreement, as negotiated, rested on 3 operational pillars that American officials presented as game-changing mechanisms. The first was enhanced biometric data sharing between American Customs and Border Protection databases and Mexican federal law enforcement systems. The second was a joint rapid response protocol under which American surveillance assets, specifically Predator B drone coverage over border corridors, would provide real-time intelligence to Mexican interdiction units within a 60-minute tasking cycle. The third was a financial intelligence sharing arrangement targeting cartel money movement through Mexican banking infrastructure, building on existing Treasury Department designations under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. Every one of these pillars assumes that the Mexican institutional counterparts receiving American intelligence, American surveillance data, and American financial targeting information are not themselves compromised by cartel penetration. Every serious analyst who has examined the evidence record on Mexican federal law enforcement institutional integrity knows that assumption is not sustainable. The cartel's demonstrated ability to receive intelligence on the agreement's terms before or immediately upon signing is not an aberration. It is the pattern. It has been the pattern through every previous bilateral cooperation agreement, through every joint operation, through every extradition negotiation. The information flows in both directions, and the cartel has invested comprehensively in ensuring it receives a copy of everything that American and Mexican officials believe they are sharing privately. The consequence of this is not simply that the border agreement will fail. It is more damaging than that. By formally committing to intelligence sharing under conditions where that intelligence will be compromised, American law enforcement is providing the Sinaloa organization with a systematic window into American operational planning, source networks, and targeting priorities. Every time a joint operation is planned under this agreement, the Sinaloa intelligence structure will have advanced knowledge. Every confidential informant whose information is shared through the new joint protocols faces elevated identification risk. Every financial target designated through the new banking cooperation mechanisms will have warning time to restructure holdings before enforcement actions can be completed. The agreement does not just fail to achieve its stated objectives. It actively creates new vulnerabilities in American law enforcement operations that did not previously exist to the same degree. I wish I could tell you something more reassuring. I genuinely do, but the honest answer, however uncomfortable, is that this agreement as structured represents a significant operational security problem for American efforts to interdict cartel operations, dressed in the language of bilateral progress. Now let me take you to where this truly becomes dangerous beyond the immediate operational domain. Mexico's institutional capacity to respond to the cartel's 18-hour demonstration is not improving. It is deteriorating. The Mexican military, the Secretariat of National Defense, has been the institution of last resort for serious cartel confrontation operations. But the military's willingness to conduct sustained operations against Sinaloa specifically has been constrained by two factors that intelligence analysis has identified as structurally binding. The first is the penetration problem I have already described, which creates force protection risks for units conducting operations when the target organization has advance warning. The second is the political calculation within the Mexican defense establishment that direct, sustained confrontation with an organization of Sinaloa's scale and firepower risks producing casualties at rates that Mexican public opinion, which has normalized a certain level of cartel violence as background noise, would not tolerate if translated into military funerals. The political constraints on Mexican executive action are equally binding. The governing coalition in Mexico City relies on political infrastructure in states where cartel economic activity is deeply embedded in local patronage networks. Aggressive federal action against cartel logistics in those states creates political costs and local governance relationships that the coalition depends on for legislative functionality. This is not corruption in the simple sense. This is the structural political economy of a state whose territorial control has been genuinely compromised by parallel governance structures that have been building for 30 years. What decisions are being made right now in Washington about whether to acknowledge publicly what every senior official privately understands will shape the next phase of this deterioration. The next 72 hours of American official response to the cartel's post-agreement operations will communicate to the Mexican government whether Washington is prepared to press for genuine enforcement or whether this agreement, like its predecessors, will be allowed to decompose quietly while public statements maintain the fiction of bilateral progress. The deeper civilizational implication of what has unfolded in these 18 hours is this. A non-state armed organization has demonstrated, with operational precision and complete impunity, that agreements between sovereign governments do not constrain its behavior in the territory it controls. That precedent does not stay contained to the narcotics trafficking domain. Every other organized criminal network, every insurgent organization, every state actor assessing American diplomatic leverage watches these demonstrations and updates its own calculation about what American-backed agreements actually enforce. When the visible answer to a bilateral security agreement is armored convoy movements, targeted executions, and electronic warfare operations conducted with zero meaningful response, the agreement's deterrent value is not diminished. It is eliminated. The clock is running, and the window is closing on whether this administration can construct a response that changes the operational calculus, not through press releases and reaffirmations of commitment, but through actions that impose genuine costs on the organizational structure that just conducted what amounts to a military demonstration against bilateral sovereignty. What happens in the coming days will determine whether that window has already closed, or whether there remains space for a response that the cartel's leadership will actually factor into its planning. My assessment, based on everything I have described today, is that the current trajectory does not point toward that response materializing. But I have been wrong before, and I will tell you this: the next development that matters will not be announced at a press conference. Watch what happens on the ground in Sonora. That is where the actual answer will appear.